Mary J. Blige singing in front of the Lincoln Memorial on Sunday in the pre-inaugural concert. 500,000 people attended. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we continue with the Associated Press reporter who joined us in studio last night to describe Washington, D.C. Jesse Holland is author of Black Men Built the Capitol, Discovering African-American History in and Around Washington, D.C. Jesse Holland, before we get to the White House and who built the White House, you mentioned the Supreme Court, and you're going to be in the next few days Associated Press's Supreme Court correspondent. Right. But can you tell us who built the Supreme Court?
Now, where the Supreme Court sits today used to be a building called the Old Brick Capitol. Now, the connection between African Americans and the Supreme Court is this. The slave market in Washington, D.C. was so robust before the Civil War that slave owners in the District of Columbia didn't have enough space to keep the slaves they were buying and selling. So what they did was they rented public jail space. Now, after the War of 1812, the Capitol was burned. Congress built a new Capitol in Washington, D.C. called the Old Brick Capitol. That building sat exactly where the Supreme Court is now. Well, after the Capitol was rebuilt, Congress moved back across the street into their own building. And the Old Brick Capitol was turned into a public jail. So African-American slaves were kept in jail cells on the site that the Supreme Court sits on. The highest court in the land sits on a spot where African-American slaves were kept in jail as they were waiting to be sold.
Because their so-called owners rented the space.
They rented public jail space and held African-American slaves in those spaces.
And this auction, this market of human beings was on what is now the National Mall?
There are several sites on the National Mall where African-American slaves were bought and sold. For example, directly in between where the Department of Education sits today and where the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum is now, used to be a slave market called Roby's Tavern. Just a block or so toward the tidal basin from there was another one called the Yellow House. The reason why we know those two were there is because an African-American free man from New York came down to Washington on vacation and was kidnapped and sold as a slave in the Yellow House, which was in that area between the Roby's Tavern and the Roby's Tavern and the Yellow House were the two slave markets that were between the Department of Education and the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. He was sold down to New Orleans as a slave, but 6 years later, he escaped back up north and ends up writing his autobiography where he tells about these slave markets that were on the National Mall within sight of the U.S. Capitol. They were all, if you can just go all up and down the mall, where the National Archives sits, right on the parade route for the inauguration tomorrow, was another slave market where African Americans were sold. On the tidal basin, where everyone comes in the springtime to see all of the cherry blossoms, there were slave markets all in Potomac Park. So as you go all up and down the National Mall, you walk across sites where African American slaves were bought and sold.
Jesse Holland, we're about to see the first family, the first African American family, take up residence in the White House. A house built by slaves?
A house built by African-American slaves. Pierre L'Enfant, the person who designed Washington, D.C., included in his original plans a Congress House, which is the Capitol, and the President's House, which is the White House. Pierre L'Enfant went to the city commissioners and asked them to find him some African-American slaves to dig the foundation that the White House sits on today. African-American slaves sawed the lumber, they baked the bricks, they quarried the marble. James Hoban, the actual architect of the White House, brought up with him from South Carolina some of his own personal slaves that were used in building the building. The reason why we know this is because James Hoban paid himself for the use of his own slaves on his project and wrote himself receipts. So this is why we know that these workers...
So he charged the government for their labor.
He charged the government for the labor of his own slaves on a project he was getting paid for. So this is why we know African-American slaves were used outside the White House. African-American slaves were also used inside the White House. Starting from Thomas Jefferson, up until just about the Civil War, African-American slaves were used as domestic staff inside the White House from their slave-owning presidents. They didn't want to pay a White House domestic staff, so they would just bring slaves from their plantations to live inside the White House. In fact, on what's now known as the first floor of the White House used to be the basement. There used to be slave quarters there. So where the Oval Diplomatic Room is in the White House today used to be slave quarters.
And how did it get changed?
Well, the White House was completely burned in the War of 1812. So a lot of the original work that was done on the White House by African-American slaves has been lost. Now, we believe that African-American slaves were also used in the reconstruction of the White House, but we have not found any receipts to prove this. But we know they were used in the original construction. But we only believe they were used in the reconstruction after the War of 1812. We just can't prove it.
Who was Paul Jennings?
Paul Jennings. Paul Jennings was one of those slaves who actually lived inside the White House. He was the property of James Madison. Now,
President Madison.
President James Madison. Now, it's because of Paul Jennings that we know the legend of Dolly Madison pulling down the painting of George Washington and fleeing before the British arrived is not true. Paul Jennings actually wrote an autobiography, one of the first tell-all books about White House life. And in his book, Paul Jennings says an African-American slave and a white gardener who lived and worked in the White House were the people who actually saved the painting of George Washington from the British troops, from being burned in the White House with British troops. Paul Jennings also was one of the instigators and one of the leaders of one of the largest mass slave escapes in United States history. After President James Madison died and his wife Dolly Madison was left behind, she sold Paul Jennings to Senator Daniel Webster. Jennings continued to live in Washington, D.C., and he was the ringleader of a group of African-American slaves and African-American freedmen and freedwomen who got together and found about 70 African-American slaves, organized them, and put them on a ship called the Pearl, and escaped Washington, D.C., up the Potomac toward Point Lookout, Maryland. Unfortunately for them, the Pearl was a wind-powered ship. And when they got to the mouth of the Potomac, the wind died. Well, they made their escape in the dead of night. When morning came, the slave owners found out that their slaves were missing. And they got on a steam-powered ship and got after them and corralled them and caught all of these slaves in Point Lookout, Maryland, and brought them back to Washington, D.C. Well, everyone on the ship, whether they were an African-American freedman or an African-American slave, was sold south. But luckily for Paul Webster, he wasn't on the ship. At the very last second, he decided that since he had made an agreement with Daniel Webster to work for him a certain amount of years and perhaps then he would be able to buy his freedom, he decided that to escape would be breaking his word. So as the Pearl was getting ready to leave Washington, D.C., Paul Jennings gets off, goes back to Daniel Webster's house, finds a letter that he had written to Senator Webster telling him his plans for escape, and destroys it. So Paul Jennings was able to escape detection in the escape of the